All right, Alexander, let's do an update as to what's going on in Ukraine. You did a very interesting video the other day on your channel explaining what went down in Kharkov and Izium. And I think that we now do have all the pieces in place. We've had all the pieces given to us so that you were able to, everyone is able to piece everything together and to get a clear picture as to what happened in Kharkov. I just want to say that I think the New York Times article was kind of the missing piece to all of this. Even though it was an obvious piece, it was obvious, everything that's going on. I think it still was that missing piece that was kind of like, okay, now I see how everything unfolded in Kharkov and Izium. I don't know if you want to comment on that or add anything to what you said in your video, but we also have now the strikes on critical infrastructure, and I believe this is the first time, if I'm not mistaken, in the 6 months of the SMO that Russia has targeted critical infrastructure, causing a blackout in much of Ukraine. Much of those power outages, they've been repaired, but you're getting power outages again today, it seems. So things haven't quite been brought back up to speed in Ukraine, and there's many different theories floating around there as to why Russia did this. The simplest theory is that it was in retaliation for Kharkov and the Putin government needed to do something. I've heard another theory saying that, another narrative saying that the Russians, and I'm paraphrasing things in a very simplistic way, maybe you also may want to add to this as well. Another narrative is that Russia just got sick and tired of the shelling of Zaporozhye. They got sick and tired of the smack being talked by the Ukraine officials constantly about, we're going to take out Russia's electricity, we're going to target Russia's electricity grid, we're going to target Belgorod, we're going to target the Russian Federation. And the other narrative is that Russia said, you know what, enough of this, we're going to show you, our power. And then you have the third narrative, which is an interesting narrative, which came from, I believe, the Military Summary Channel, which basically highlighted that the troops in Kharkov, many of the troops and much of the assets were being transported via north to south from Kharkov to Kherson in order to get everything in place for another counteroffensive towards Ugledar and eventually targeting Mariupol. And the Russians saw this, and they saw that everything's being transported by electric rail, and they hit it. They shut down the electric rail, and then they annihilated the assets that were being transported by train. Anyway, you may want to talk about Izium. You want to maybe add to that, and you may want to add to the very three broad narratives that I've talked about with regards to the critical infrastructure strike, or maybe there's a fourth narrative that I haven't talked about. I don't know.
I think that was actually a masterly summary. Can I just say what I see? Now, I mean, I don't. Let me start with it. We'll come to the New York Times article in a moment, but I don't believe this attack on the infrastructure is a simple event. I think it's a very big event because it goes against the original legal structure of the SMO. Now, if you remember what the SMO was, the special military operation, and it was all about protecting, helping Donbass, recognizing the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and helping them protect themselves and helping liberate their territories. And clearly, though this has never been confirmed, there's clearly a secondary annex to all of this, which is to establish a land bridge to Crimea. And that was why Kherson region and much of Zaporozhye region were also occupied, and why the Russians are holding on to and defending Kherson. That part of it's never been publicized, but we can infer its existence. But the main part of the SMO was about protecting Donetsk and Lugansk and helping them to liberate their territories. Now, when the Russians first advanced into Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense was constantly publishing this mantra, which from time to time they still have been doing, and other Russian officials still have been doing, saying that the purpose of the SMO is not going to be achieved by occupying Ukrainian cities. It's not going to be achieved by attacking civilian infrastructure. The Russian military will only attack Ukrainian military infrastructure. And they have indeed. They've attacked many factories, many plants, many hostels and hotels and buildings which the Ukrainian army has been using. But they have avoided attacking civilian infrastructure. So yesterday, that changed, and on an enormous scale. They attacked unequivocally civilian infrastructure. They went after Ukraine's power grid. And the information which dribbling through today is that they renewed their attacks up to a certain point this morning. Now, I am inclined to think that the military summary channels is absolutely correct. Part of the purpose was to strike those trains, destroy those reinforcements, create havoc amongst them. And I'm sure that was part of the tactical, operational decision which was made. And I also think that the Kharkiv offensive has clearly played a role here. But it is such a big departure from the original legal framework of the SMO that one does have to ask and wonder whether perhaps something bigger is on its way. And there are currently rumours flying around Moscow based upon a proposal made by a Russian MP that the framework of the SMO is going to be changed. And in place of an SMO, the SMO, which is all about supposedly helping Donetsk and Lugansk liberate their territory, something, by the way, in which the militia of Donetsk and Lugansk are being given priority. But what we will now get is something which will be upgraded into an anti-terrorist operation. Now, if you approach that as an anti-terrorist operation, then that means that Ukrainian armed forces can be classified as terrorists. The Russian military is then tasked with destroying terrorists, as it has in Syria, as it did in Chechnya. That would greatly extend the reach and scope of Russian military operations in Ukraine.
Leadership now, too?
Leadership too, absolutely. Yeah, leadership too, because they would be terrorists. Remember, I mean, the Russians in both Syria and in the Caucasus directly targeted people that they classified as terrorist leaders. And in fact, eventually in the Caucasus war, they caught up and killed all of them. So I mean, it would take in the Ukrainian leadership as well. It would be a significant escalation. It would not be a declaration of war. It would not require mass mobilization. I don't personally think. I think this business of mass mobilization is a complete misunderstanding of the problem, in the sense that I don't think the problem is that Russia doesn't have enough military to wrap up the situation in Ukraine, enough serving military. It's rather that Putin, as he, by the way, often does, constrained what the Russian military are able to do by the initial structure that he imposed upon them. Now, there was a very interesting discussion by a Russian military journalist who said that Ukraine's strike force, that the strike force that Ukraine has deployed both in Kherson region and in Kharkiv, that this is all comes from a force that was built up over the last 6 months with the help of the West, re-equipped with weapons supplied by NATO, and that this force numbers around 10 brigades, 30,000 men. Half of them were assigned to attack Kherson, half of them were assigned to attack in Kharkiv. And that actually, by the way, correlates very well with the figures. Now, if we're talking about 30,000 men in total in these reserves, many of them, by the way, have been killed over the course of the fighting. The idea that the Russian military cannot find enough men to counter this force, and indeed to counter any other force that Ukraine has from its existing standing forces, seems to me absurd. People talk about the Ukrainian armed forces as numbering 1 million men, which, by the way, they don't, not anywhere close. Russia's armed forces do number 1 million men. I mean, that's their standing military. They can certainly find troops to deal with all of this problem. They haven't used them because of the nature of the framework of the SMO. If you have it extended into a sort of anti-terrorist operation, then of course you can start to take a much more proactive approach than the Russians have been doing up to now. And the fact that, as I said, we've had these strikes on these very clear civilian facilities, because that's what they are, the energy network, the energy grid, that does imply that that is already a departure from the framework of the SMO, and it could very well point to something bigger, something more radical, perhaps an announcement over the next few days, perhaps at some point this week, that the nature of the SMO is going to be extended. Now, I'm just going to add one other thing, which is that if that is what Putin intends to do, then the Ukrainian shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power station plays well into this, because he can argue that these are terrorist strikes, and that demonstrates the terroristic nature of the Ukrainian government, and that therefore clears the way for him to extend the SMO in this kind of way. Putin always likes to do things in this very, very structured way, and it would be consistent with his personality. Now, I want to stress, I don't know he's going to do these things, but given the extent of the departure from the SMO and the way in which it's been framed up to now, that these strikes on the civilian facility are, then it does look as if he's finally, after the debacle in Kharkiv, which was a debacle, he's finally perhaps come to understand that he can't achieve his objectives in Ukraine if he sticks with the present framework, that he has to work towards extending and revising it.
Yeah, before you get into the New York Times article in ETHEREUM, a couple of questions. It seems like the actions are preceding the actual words in this case, the actual changing of the SMO framework to an anti-terrorist operation. In other words, the bombing of the infrastructure, this action is leading you to believe that they've already decided that they're going to change the wording of this conflict. They've already taken it to heart, and they've said, we're going to do it, so let's just go right now and go after the infrastructure, and we'll change the wording later on in the week. And who does Putin have to argue this to? I mean, I understand that he wants his international partners on board. I understand that he wants the approval of the Russian people on board. But is there any other people that he needs to argue this change of direction to, or is this more for his own way of rationalizing this in a way? You know what I mean? Sometimes you want in your own mind to feel like you're going about something in a right way.
Yes, I think it's the second. I think that if you follow Russian media, and I don't mind the way mean Russian telegram channels, which we all have to go to in order to get updates on what's going on in the battle. They're much more
like late night talk shows and news shows.
I mean, late night talk shows, letters to the media, these kind of things. If you follow what people in Russia are saying, they are furious about what happened in Kharkiv. They have been increasingly exasperated for months about Putin being far too slow to respond. We discussed in our previous program how bad the optics were of him going off to the Far East and giving clever speeches there with all his military entourage and with 50,000 men engaging in maneuvers, and people asking, well, why aren't those men doing something useful in Ukraine? Why are they instead engaging in maneuvers? And that, that is a widely publicized talking point in Russia. And I mean, the other thing, and I've heard this now, from some people, but of course there were the celebrations in Moscow of the Day of the City, and Putin gave an address to that. It all looked very incongruous, given the news from Kharkiv. So, people are angry, and that is going to affect Putin's position. Now, there have been elections, by the way, in Russia. There were elections on Sunday to local councils, and also to, there were gubernatorial elections. And as it invariably happens, United Russia has won in pretty much all of them. But that was based upon the accumulated goodwill that Putin had achieved as a result of his decision to launch this intervention in Ukraine in the first place. If things continue to slip as they've been doing, then, as I said, that political support in Russia itself will start to crumble. And I think he's politician enough to understand that. So I think the pressure is not on him to persuade people to extend the remit of the SMO, be it in Ukraine itself or internationally. The real pressure, which is in Russia, is for him, on the contrary, to extend the SMO in the way that people in Russia want. So, he's been resisting doing that up to now. I get him. We can't know what exactly has been going on in his mind, what exactly was being talked about within the Russian leadership. It's quite possible that the internal security people were unsure how things would work out, whether the economic people in the government were perhaps uneasy about extending it to the extent that this looks like it's going. He might have felt the need to keep people like Nabulina, the central bank chair, on board. He might also possibly have had to talk the Chinese and the Indians and all those sort of people, tell them this is a very limited operation. We're not after Ukraine's territory. All of that made sense a few months ago. It doesn't make any sense any longer. And on the contrary, as I said, the pressure on him, the political pressure, will be to start pushing him to take a more decisive steps than he has up to this moment. Now, as I said, he's a very stubborn man. That's another aspect of Putin's personality that people don't know. He's a very proud man. He finds it very difficult to change course. But I think the political pressure is on him now. And the very fact that there's been this attack on the civilian infrastructure, which is, as I say, clearly a departure from the terms of the SMO, and which can only happen following authorization from him, does suggest that he's now gradually edging towards that position where the remit of the SMO is extended.
All right, so this is a good way to segue into the New York Times article in ETHEREUM, because I believe that there was and there is no choice other than for Putin to find a way within himself to put that stubbornness to the side and to start being a little bit more flexible, because everything is at stake.
Yeah.
Everything. The existence of the Russian Federation is at stake here. This is not, and I don't want to downplay these conflicts. This is not Syria. It's not Transnistria. It's not Georgia. In my opinion, this isn't a conflict, number one, you can freeze.
No.
Like Russia is very good at doing, and Putin's very good at freezing conflicts. This is not a conflict that you can freeze. And this is not a conflict where NATO is going to go away if if some sort of agreement is worked out or some sort of stoppage comes in the winter, whatever it is. This is not a conflict where NATO is just going to pick up their ball and go home. NATO and the collective West, once again, in my opinion, has been very, very clear. And I say this to their, it sounds strange for me to say this, Alexander, I say this to their credit. They haven't kept anything secret as to their plans for Russia.
No.
You know, they've been crystal clear what they want to do to Russia and how they want to use Ukraine to do that to Russia.
Yes.
They've been very upfront about it. I think the Russian people and the media, they've picked up on it as well, obviously. So we go back to what got us in this position, which has led the Security Council and Putin's team to really not have any other options than to try and be a bit more flexible. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Can I just say this? We go back to the New York Times article. I mean, it's absolutely clear that the Kharkiv offensive was launched because Western intelligence is now basically directing Ukraine's military moves. Not entirely, but to a great extent. They don't seem to have been particularly keen on the Kherson offensive, but they picked up the fact that the Russian force in ETHEREUM had been significantly reduced in number. By the way, I've just done a program for my own channel. It's not yet up, but I've done a bit of arithmetic based on what Russian officials have been saying. And in my opinion, based on my estimates, which are purely inferred, they're not based on actual knowledge, but inferred information, but it's consistent with what I've seen. I think that the total number of Russian regular army troops in ETHEREUM was around 2,000. I mean, that whole area was defended by around 2,000 men against a Ukrainian force of around 15,000. Now, that hadn't always been the case. There'd been once upon a time a lot more Russian troops in ETHEREUM, but they've been gradually drawn down. US intelligence obviously knows all about that. They've been passing all this information to Ukraine. They've been telling them, you strike here. There are very few Russian forces in this area. You can win a quick, decisive victory. If you're lucky, you might even be able to encircle these 2,000 men, which would be a disaster for the Russians. And so this is the place which you should strike. And that's what the Ukrainians did. And they came very close. If we're talking about encircling those Russian forces, they came very close to pulling it off. Now, that tells you how dangerous this is. And if you go back to those speeches that Putin made and which convinced the Russian people to support the intervention in Ukraine, he made it very clear then that it was an existential issue for Russia, that Ukraine was going to be joining NATO, that its destination was to join NATO, that it was talking about adopting nuclear weapons, developing its own nuclear weapons, that it was going to have, that there was a real possibility of US military strike forces being created in Eastern Ukraine, only a couple of 100 kilometers from Moscow itself. So he himself has told the Russian people how existential it is. And I think he's right. But more to the point, the Russian people think he is right. If this fails, the Russian people have heard their leader telling them that this is an existential war. They will say afterwards, what hope for Russia? And when people lose hope, well, a country that has no hope has no future. Now, as you absolutely correctly say, looking at this from the other side, NATO has been increasingly aggressive. They've been talking about demilitarizing Russia. They've been clearly working towards cutting Russia back down to what it was in the 1990s. So,
and more. I would say even more.
And even more. And I mean, there's even some NGOs who are talking about breaking the whole country up. So it is an existential thing. It's an existential play. Now, the question is, he told the Russian people that it was, But some of his early actions suggest that he was still hoping for some sort of a compromise. He limited the framework of the SMO in the way that we've discussed. He was angling for negotiations with Zelensky. If you remember, there was all those complicated negotiations in February and March. There was the meeting in Istanbul. It seems that he was still hoping up to that point that he could come to some kind of negotiated diplomatic solution. Very typical of the way Russia, by the way, tends to approach its wars, entirely consistent with the approach that he's taken in Syria. It doesn't work in Ukraine. Now, one must assume that at some point he will understand that. And perhaps this attack on the civilian infrastructure that we've just seen may point to the fact that he has now understood it and that he will do that which he has to do if he is to preserve his legacy and his country.
Final two questions. And his country. Final two questions. Quickly, this will be just a quick question. There was nothing wrong with him in March. What was it, March or April, to try and find a peaceful solution to this conflict. But it is correct to say that it wasn't the Russians that backed out of the peace process. I think we know conclusively that it was Zelensky under the orders of Boris Johnson that sabotaged those negotiations. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. It's even been admitted now by people like Fiona Hill. So, I mean, this is indisputable. It is unequivocally and completely true. Now, Putin should have drawn conclusions from this. And my own sense is that after the capture or liberation, if you prefer, of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, I think he said to himself, well, things are going to plan. I'm going to take my eye off the ball. I'm going to let things go as they've been going. We are gradually gaining ground in Donbass every day, which they have been. Ukraine's ability to conduct an offensive is probably limited. The West is falling into a deep economic crisis, which it is. Sooner or later, sometime in the winter, they will come to terms. It's not going to happen. And I think this business in Kharkiv has probably served as the final wake-up call.
Yeah, I think it's really I can imagine for Russian citizens, if it's true, and I say if this is true, that there are, because I'm being very careful with my wording, if there are NATO or foreign mercenary forces enmeshed with the strike force in Kharkov, it must be very jarring to know that these forces are right up to your border. They're there. I imagine psychologically that's also that's playing a big role. But you may want to comment on that. And then the final question that I have for you is Ugledar. And it seems, we can't confirm this is going to be 100%, but it looks like the Ukraine military is ready for another counteroffensive, once again, in the Kherson region, Ugledar. And I guess the goal, the prize is, in their minds, the prize is Mariupol.
Absolutely,
What
indeed,
do you
that's
think
exactly
of that?
Well, I mean,
and should Russia, and just my own opinion there, my own opinion is just real quick, and I think you mentioned it in your video, it's also not a good look that after 6 months of this, it appears from optics, and I'm always speaking of optics, that Russia is on the defensive.
Absolutely.
I also don't think that's also not a good look either. Just from an optics, I'm not saying militarily that's the case. Yeah. I'm saying from an optics perspective, because I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm saying. I don't want to, Ukraine is more powerful than Russia military. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying from an optics perspective, it looks like Russia's on the defensive. Anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. You've got to always understand that in war, optics matter. I mean, I think in that program, what the program you're referring to, I discussed the Tet Offensive, North Vietnam's
Yes.
Tet Offensive in 1968. Now, most people who know about these things have said that that offensive in its military objectives was a complete failure. It didn't capture any territory. It caused enormous losses to the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. But for the United States, or the Johnson administration, it was a political disaster. So in war, optics can be as important as what goes on the battlefield. So the fact that, Russia, which up to just 3 weeks ago, was advancing, is now on the back foot, is, a shattering shock. Not just, for analysts like us, but also principally and most importantly for the Russian people, for people in Donbass, for people in, in Kherson region, in all of these places. They're saying, well, maybe this, we aren't going to win after all. Maybe this isn't going to be the liberation that we all expected. So you've got to deal with that. You've got to somehow overcome this problem. Now, Ugledar and Mariupol, I think that Mariupol is such a totemic victory for the Russians in this war that I think that its loss, its recapture by Ukraine, would be such a total disaster that I can't bring myself to believe that the Russians will allow it to happen. I think that they will take steps to make sure that it doesn't happen. And if that really does look like there's going to be a Ukrainian breakthrough in Ugledar, then, as I said, that would be something that the Russians would have to quickly reverse, throwing away whatever constraints they have. Because if Mariupol were to be recaptured by Ukraine, well, that would be such a humiliation that I can't imagine Putin's position in Russia itself remaining stable for much longer. And of course, the entire operation at that point would collapse. Now, I'm going to say one thing about Ugledar. I said I made some inferences based on comments various Russian officials have been making that the Russian force in Kharkiv was only 2,000 men. Well, I don't know that for a fact, but it is a deduction which is fully consistent with the known facts. And if you go to my program, you'll see the sequence of ways in which I arrived at that conclusion. Now, in Ugledar, it is not like that. I mean, we all know that there are Russian Marines there and Russian naval infantry. It's much closer to Russian supply lines. I would have thought that a Ukrainian force which tried to launch an offensive in Ugledar, near Ugledar, is going to come up against much more heavy Russian resistance than the Kharkiv offensive basically encountered no resistance at all. So I think that's probably the difference. I mean, in Kherson region, when the Russians have defended, we see that are able to defend with great skill and great effect and inflicting devastating losses on Ukrainian attackers. Now, logically, I would assume that it was the same in Ugledar. But, war is unpredictable. We'll just have to see.
For a real final question then, just one more quick question so we can wrap up the video. I agree with you there. It's going to be very, very difficult for Ukraine to break through in Ugledar. Knowing that, and knowing what the U.S. advised Ukraine to do in Kharkov, i.e. they said, this is going to be easy. There's only 2,000 men there. Russia's thinning out their forces in Kharkov. Go there. That's where you should go. Let's get the easy win and let our PR, spin, social media machine do the rest. And it did. The social media and optics of the collective West, they started to spin the whole narrative. The Russians left equipment behind. The Russians left in a panic. None of that is true. The Russians did not leave in a panic. They didn't leave military equipment behind. But once again, we go back to optics. Optics matter. Why would the U.S. advise Ukraine to now go after Kherson? Are they getting cocky? Are they getting
Yeah.
arrogant? Or is this Zelensky ignoring U.S. advice and saying, just, I won Kharkov, leave me alone,
Yeah.
Biden. Let me go down to Kherson. What do you think is the reasoning?
I've no doubt it's Zelensky. I don't think it's the US at all. I mean, on the contrary, the briefings that we were getting, the media stories was that the US were advising Zelensky to undertake limited offensives, not to try too much in too many places. But, there's this expression, getting dizzy with success. He's now achieved a victory in Kharkiv region. He's able to tell his people, I've won this great victory in Kharkiv region. And of course, it's perhaps understandable at a human level that he wants to maintain momentum. So he's attacking in places like Krasny Liman. He's attacking in Ugleda. He's apparently thinking of renewing his offensive in Kherson region. He appears for the moment to be disregarding the advice that he's been given by the US. And this despite the fact that his Kharkiv force, which, as remember, is, accounts for something like half this strike force that, this Russian journalist, who seemed very well informed, suggested Ukraine has put together over the last few months. Well, it seems that this force has lost something like 2,000 men killed out of the 15,000 who were committed, almost certainly to bombs, artillery, all that kind of thing. Maybe that's an exaggeration because, of course, that figure comes from the Russian Defense Ministry. But anyway, they've definitely suffered losses. In Kherson region, they've suffered more losses. But, Zelensky may be saying to himself, this is the moment when we've got them on the back foot. We must go on pushing. I can very easily see how Zelensky might have, got carried away, dizzy with success, maybe ordering offensives in all kinds of directions. And that, by the way, might give the Russians an opportunity to throw his forces back and reverse the mood that's starting to take hold. Let me repeat again a point that a very, very important point, which is that Russia has all the resources it needs to resolve this problem, all of them. It doesn't have to mobilize its forces. I mean, this is a complete misunderstanding. It doesn't have to order mobilization. It doesn't have to mobilize its economy. It doesn't have to mobilize its army. It doesn't have to call up vast numbers of reservists. It's got all the troops it needs to deal with this thing. It's got its air force. Its aviation has only very recently started to play a significant role in the war. Its navy is still intact. It's churning out missiles at a prodigious rate, which has left the West astonished. It's got electronic warfare systems. It's got, you name it, they've got it. What they need to do is, if they're going to turn this thing round, is they've got to overcome their own constraints, the limitations,
exactly.
The limitations that they have
self-imposed,
the self-imposed limitations that they have imposed upon themselves. And one can also sense, and a Russian member of our community actually wrote to me about this. He said that there's a particular factor. There's that a lot of Russians, and Putin definitely himself, consider that it's the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian people are part of the great Russian nation. Well, that may be true, or may once have been true, but it doesn't help you having those sentiments in a war now. I mean, during the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln also continued to consider the people of the southern states part of the great United Nation, the part of the US nation. And they eventually became that again after the war was over. But he had to win the war first.
Yeah. And I would say that from the Ukrainian side of things, it would be best for them, my opinion, it would be best for them to find a way back to the negotiating table now.
Absolutely. This
Don't
is the
get
best.
too arrogant. Don't get too
Exactly.
cocky about everything.
Yes.
Find a way to negotiate now.
Yes, yes, yes. That is exactly correct. That is exactly right. This is the best moment Ukraine has had since the start of this conflict to negotiate a compromise. If they overplay their hand at this moment in time, it could turn out disastrous for them. I completely agree.
Yeah. All right, let's end it there. The Duran.locals.com, Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day.